Hi, everyone. In this activity, we're going to be looking at R Markdown, how we can use it to knit or create different formats, how we can use R Markdown with simple text formatting using what's called Markdown syntax, how we can insert code into our output documents using code chunks, how we can modify options for those code chunks, and lastly, how we can include graphics and tables from data sets, created from data sets in our Markdown documents. So the first thing we're going to do is open up RStudio and create an R Markdown document. This comes already bundled into RStudio, this tool of R Markdown. Okay. So we'll open up RStudio here. And you likely see something like this. Maybe you have a R script, a blank R script open. So to open up an R Markdown document, which is different than an R script like this, we'll go File, New File, and then we'll select R Markdown. Notice all these options. You can produce a lot of things with RStudio. We're just going to be looking at R Markdown here. Okay. And there's even lots of options for templates. If you're going to be making a presentation with R Markdown, creating shiny dashboard or other type of interactive interface, we're just going to be doing R Markdown. We'll start with HTML. We'll call this Intro to R Markdown. We can change the title like this. You can put your name here. So say something like, I think I gave the example, Taylor Swift in the document. Okay. And then you can enter the date manually here, or you can leave it to where it makes it dynamic. Let's leave it as being dynamic here because that's a little bit more useful. And we'll click OK. And then R opens up this template document. RStudio opens up this template document that is a basic R Markdown file. Okay. Let's look back at our activity here. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to knit this R Markdown document, which is sort of like compiling it. So there's a few different ways we can knit the document. You can click the knit button, which has a yarn image or logo next to it. Or you can use the shortcut button, which on a Mac is Command-Shift-K, or on Windows is Control-Shift-K. Personally, I click the knit button, although the shortcut commands are always nice once you get the hang of those. Okay. So let's click the knit button and see what this looks like. It'll ask you what you want to name your document. You can call it Activity 2 or something like that. The name is not too important. Keep track of where you're saving it though, as you'll want to refer back to that later and be able to find this document. So we knit it. R is running currently, so it shows us that stop sign. And then it shows us this output HTML document. Okay. So you see here's the title that we typed, the name of the author, dynamically selected the date. And then here's some text, some simple text interwoven with R code and the output produced from that R code. And then also a plot and then some more text. So this document is what produced all of that. We can see here's the text, here's the R code enclosed in these chunks, what we call them, or blocks of R code. They're called chunks. And this produced the HTML document here that we see. So next, now that we've knit to HTML, we will verify that we can modify the top of the R Markdown document called the YAML by specifying what the output file format will be. Okay. The easiest way to do that, if we don't want an HTML document, we can knit to, say, PDF by clicking here on this little arrow, down arrow next to the knit button. And then you can say knit to PDF. So note that there's these other options. We defaulted to knit to HTML. You can do PDF or Microsoft Word document. We will try PDF next. And it automatically updates the YAML for us. Okay, and this part again, this whole section here enclosed with these dashes, these 3 dashes, this is called the YAML. It's like the header of the R Markdown document. And here's the PDF that was produced. So similar to the HTML file that was produced, but the font is a little bit different. And now we have this PDF document that is created in the same folder or directory that our R Markdown document is residing in, that it was created in. So sometimes a collaborator might want a PDF document for the report of your analysis. Sometimes HTML documents are nicer. They're potentially more customizable. There's various reasons depending on which output format you would desire. Okay, and lastly, we will knit to a Microsoft Word document. Okay. Notice it automatically updated the YAML when we clicked that. And now here's this Word document that's produced, which has the title, name of the author, the date that is dynamically constructed, and then text again with R code interwoven with the output produced from it and the plot. Okay. And this is a modifiable Word document. So this is, again, a template that our studio gives us by default, but we'll modify to put our own code, our own R code in here, and our own text, typically. But for this activity, we're okay with keeping the template sort of as it is. Okay. So let's take a look at the activity directions again. So we created a new R Markdown document for each of the most common formats, and we knit each of them. So it's good to think about how does this activity, how did the output documents produced in this activity so far differ? So they were very similar in structure for the most part, actually, with the template file. So not too much different in terms of the output. The inputs, the only thing that changed, none of the simple text or the code in the chunks changed at all. The only thing that changed was the YAML, and specifically in this output section of the YAML. That's the only thing that changed. And note, if you got an error when trying to knit to PDF, you might need to run this in the console in order to install LaTeX through R Markdown. For the rest of this document, though, for this activity, we'll be knitting to HTML. So let's update that before we move on here. So we'll knit back to HTML. Just update that. So that's our original one that we first got. And when you knit to multiple output file types, it sort of like stacks them like this, but that's not a problem. It just goes to which one's at the top. For readability, you can get rid of these like this. And that produces the same exact document. All right. So starting with this section on what we call Markdown. So this is called R Markdown, this tool, because it's sort of bridging two main parts, the R programming language and the Markdown language. So Markdown is a relatively simple and lightweight set of conventions that allows us to format plain text. So what we mean by that is that we can create headers using Markdown syntax like this. We can create hyperlinks, and we can italicize, bold, superscripts, and subscripts as well. We'll start with the headers. We'll show how that works. So in R Markdown, by default, it has this first header, which R Markdown knows it's a header because there's 2 pound signs and then a space. It knows this is a second level header. It has this other second level header. And notice in the output how that looks. So we had R Markdown and then including plots. So this is the header that was produced from that Markdown code in the R Markdown document. Okay. So we can create a third level header with 3 pound signs. And so we might have something like this. And then we need to knit to see the output document. Now you can see we have the second level header and then this third level header that I added in that's a little bit smaller in its font size. So that's headers. You can also, you can also have first level headers. I guess we could show that real quick. So this is a first level header. I'll just write some example nonsense, I guess, that maybe we're typing up an analysis. Okay. And then maybe we have a second level header. Okay, so first level header, second level header. You can see how the fonts get progressively smaller. Okay. So that was headers. That's one part of Markdown, the Markdown language that you can use. You can also insert hyperlinks. Okay. Actually, let's rename these sections properly. So section 1, section 2, and section 3. So following the directions here, we'll call this section 1, section 2, and section 3. Great. All right. Now looking back at the activity. Okay, so we can include a hyperlink, and that can be done in a few ways. We'll look at how we can link to the Google homepage here. Okay, so let's copy here this one. And we'll add it to, say, section 3 here. So maybe we'll get rid of this. So we'll say a useful website for debugging R code is Google. And then if we knit that, we'll see it's a hyperlink where it links to the Google homepage. Okay. All right. So you can create hyperlinks. You can also link to images to include them in that way, or GIFs, or other types of objects. Although URLs, typically creating a hyperlink is the most common way this is used. But again, there's lots of different options. And this is, again, all part of what we'd call Markdown, this Markdown language. Another part of the Markdown language is that we can italicize text, bold it, have it formatted slightly differently commonly to indicate that it's code or an R object that we're referring to. We can have superscripts, although I don't commonly use this feature, and subscripts. And again, I don't commonly use this, but it's something you can do with Markdown. So let's now include an italicized word or phrase, bolded word or phrase, a word styled such that we want to show that it's code, a superscript, and subscript. And I'll give some demonstration words just for examples, but you can use whatever words or phrases you want. Okay, so let's work down the line. Italic, bold, code. Let's see. So we can say, this is an example of an italicized word. This word is bolded and this word is referring to an R package, we'll say. Okay, and to get this, we'll use what's called a backtick. This is located on a traditional keyboard on the key that's immediately to the left of the number 1 above QWERTY, QWERTY, that section of the keyboard. So just to the left of 1 and just below the escape key. That's the backtick symbol. So let's knit this. Okay, we can see it's italicized, it's bolded, and then that was formatted slightly differently to refer to it being an R object. Okay. And then lastly, we have superscript and a subscript. Okay. So we can also incorporate superscripts and subscripts in R Markdown. See how that looks. So that's how we can use some, we'd call it simple text formatting, to have hyperlinks, bolding, italicize words, format them slightly different, superscripts, subscripts. Okay. And outside of that, there's a little bit more functionality with Markdown, the formatting for the text outside of R code or R chunks. But for the most part, that's pretty much what we'll use, is those sort of options. So that's why they say it's relatively simple. There's not super complex ways to format the code. There's just a few things we can do to customize it. Yeah. So we did that. Okay. So yes, now getting to the real, I would say, power, the real utility of our Markdown documents. And that's being able to use code in tandem with writing simple text like we were before. So let's add a code chunk to our document. Here's an example of one you could do where you have pi times Euler's number, we'd call it exp of 1. This is something you could do, and R will tell you it's that number. To insert a code chunk, so a space like this is a code chunk. To insert a new one in R, a new code chunk, you can go up here and click down and then R, because it's going to be an R programming chunk. You can have other languages in here like Python. This is RCPP, which is like a blend of like C++ and R code, SQL, Stan, Bash. Okay, we're doing R. So this allows us to write program that's programming code, essentially, that's enclosed in this little mini environment that will be executed. So we can do it using this insert code chunk GUI button up here, or you can do Control or Command Alt I. That's a shortcut to insert a new code chunk. So we're going to insert a new code chunk, and we're going to name it Uptown chunk, because you can name these code chunks. So to give a chunk a name, you'll notice that these chunks that were already in this template document, the first one is named setup. So that's just a name of that chunk. It's not really functional, it's more of just a label. And then the second chunk was called cars. But again, it's just a label. It's not really a functional option or anything like that. So our chunk down here, we will name Uptown chunk. And we're going to use the include graphics function from the knitr package to include an image from this URL. So I'll copy that. And probably the easiest way to use it from the knitr package is to do knitr like this, : which tells R we want to use the knitr package, and then the function include underscore graphics. This is the function from the knitr package. So we'll specify it like this, and then we put the URL inside the parentheses here. So we'll copy this. And then in quotes, paste that URL. It can be single or double quotes, either one would work here. And then we can knit the document to see how that looks. Okay. So you can see it grabbed the image from that URL, and then it inserted the image into our output HTML document. Okay. And it's showing the R code that produced that output below. Okay. All right. We're on our way. So with these code chunks, these blocks of R code, there are several options we can specify for each of them. Some of the most commonly used chunk options are eval, which controls whether or not that R code is evaluated or compiled when we click the knit button. Echo, which controls whether or not the code is displayed in the output document that's produced. So like in this example, echo by default is set to true, so this R code shows up. It's showing the R code that was executed. The include option specifies whether or not code output, everything associated with that chunk is shown at all or not. So if you don't want to show the code, you don't want to show any images or anything produced from that code chunk, you would set include equals false as the code chunk option. And we'll look at how you can specify those options. Warning and error. So warning controls whether or not warnings are displayed from R code being run. Error controls whether or not the document will keep knitting if an error occurs in the R code. Fig.width controls the width of figures produced within that code chunk, similarly with fig.height. And fig.align controls the alignment of images produced from that chunk. So you can do left aligned, center, or right aligned. So let's modify the Uptown chunk code chunk by setting the echo option to be false. How we do that We look in here, we'll add a comma after the chunk name, and then we'll say echo equals false. And R is not very particular with the spacing in here. You could have a space or not. It would be fine. But false needs to be all caps, false, like that. And echo should be lowercase echo, like this. Okay. So now this code won't show up in the output, but it's still executed. It's still grabbing that image. Now there's just no R code there. Typically, if you were showing results to somebody who did not know R programming at all, you would want to have echo equals false for most of, if not all of your code chunks, because the code wouldn't mean anything to them. They just want to see your results, not your programming code. All right. Toggle the include and eval chunks and see what happens. So you can also add the include and eval chunks. So if you want to add another chunk option, you'll separate them by commas. So then you can do include equals false. Then we see if we add that option, the image completely goes away. Nothing is being included from that code chunk at all. It's still being executed. It's just not showing anything that's produced from that chunk in this document. So sometimes you might have calculations, like a model needs to be fit, algebra needs to be done, something like that. Maybe you just don't want to show anything associated with it. You just want to do calculations in there. That's when that would be helpful. Eval. Okay, so we could have eval equals false, but echo equals true. So echo saying show the code, yes. Eval, don't actually evaluate the code though, or compile it. So let's see what that looks like. So echo equals true, it's showing this, but eval equals false, so it didn't grab the image, it didn't execute this code. All right. Let's see, and then we're going to look at including plots, inline R code, and then some tables. Okay, so for including plots, what's really cool about R Markdown is if you produce a plot in a chunk of R code, it shows up in the R Markdown document. So like previously, we were grabbing that image from online. We can also create images within R Markdown like this scatter plot here. Okay. So we'll create a new code chunk to create this scatter plot here at the bottom of our R Markdown document. So we'll insert a new chunk. You can do it like this, clicking here, or doing Control-Shift-I again, or Command-Shift-I. We're just going to paste that code right in, see how that looks. Okay. See all these warnings that showed up? So when we loaded the tidyverse, it can give a lot of messages like that show up, which can be a little bit annoying. I found these are a little bit hard to get rid of. The easiest way that I've found to get rid of these messages when you load a package like the tidyverse is to load the package in the setup chunk at the top, then those messages tend to go away. It's kind of silly. You're loading the package in two spots, but that's one way to get those messages to go away. So now if we renit it, the messages from loading the tidyverse don't show up anymore. That's the easiest way I found to do that. because the setup chunk doesn't show up at all. So it keeps it nice and tidy and neater, more neat down here. All right. So we included that scatter plot. If we wanted to re-include that image, we would change eval back to true for that chunk option for the uptown chunk. Yeah. All right, so now it's back in there, and we still have our scatter plot that we're producing underneath that now. Okay. All right. We're getting there. Okay, so you can also toggle the fig.height, fig.width option, fig.align. Okay, so let's take a look at those. So we add a comma. Notice I didn't name this chunk. You don't have to name all your chunks. It's good practice too. So maybe we should. We'll call it like scatter plot. But you don't have to. So we'll say fig dot align equals center. So we want that image to be in the center of the output document for the scatter plot. So see how it's more centered. Okay. Maybe we want it to be not so tall. So we could say fig.height. Not sure what the units are, to be honest. Let's take a look when we do like 3. Okay, yeah, that squished it a little bit. So 3, we made it a little bit shorter than it was before. Maybe we want it a little bit wider even than it is now for some reason. Then we could do fig.width equals like 6. Maybe we want it to be a little bit longer across the page for some reason. That might have stretched it a little bit, not much, I guess. But that's the idea. We can toggle the width and height of the graphic being produced and its alignment. So here's center. Yeah, so we can also do right aligned. Left, center, and right are the main options for the fig.align. There's to the right. Let's keep it at center though. That's usually nicer. Okay. So that was all about including images. Inline R code is another neat feature of R Markdown. So if we want to refer to numbers based on calculations in the middle of our simple text, our writing, dynamically, we can do that using inline R code. Maybe I want a sentence that says, it rained blank inches today. And I want my R script to fill in that number based on a CSV file that it's pointing to, a data file. Okay. We can do that with this inline R code. So for example, you might have this code in a chunk that's creating these variables, X bar and SE, standard error and sample mean variables. And then you have a sentence that you type out that is like this. So here's the first portion of inline R code, which is enclosed in these backticks. And it's saying it's going to be R code here in this little mini bit of code inside this sentence. And then here's the actual R code that's being executed. And same with over here. And so this would be what you write in the R Markdown file. When you knit it, you would end up producing this sentence. So this would evaluate just to the number minus 0.548, and this would evaluate to the number 4.548. So we'll show this same exact sentence, and our code will use the same stuff. So let's copy this code. Okay. And then we're going to insert an R code chunk at the bottom of our document here. Okay, so new chunk. Maybe we'll even give this a heading. Time for some inline R code. Maybe here. Time. Let's create a scatter plot. All right. So inline R code, and then the activity. Yeah, let's copy this sentence verbatim here. Okay. Paste it here. Okay, here's the inline R code. And again, these backticks are the key just to the left of the number 1 on the keyboard. That's how we get those. Okay, so if we knit this, we can see the R code is sort of invisible underneath. It just ends up producing these numbers here. And we could hide this chunk of code if we wanted to. So this is a way to have dynamic sentences in your report, your output document, that can have the numbers update based on underlying data or R code that is updating. Okay. All right. Okay. One of the last things we'll look at here is how we can use tables in R Markdown documents. So here's an example of how we can produce a table using the cable function from the knitter package. Okay. This creates a data set with variables mpg, cylinders, displacement, and horsepower. And then it produces this resulting table. It's a little bit aligned a little bit funny there. This resulting table in the R Markdown document. So it's nice you can produce this table when you're knitting to HTML, PDF, or a Word document, all of them. So the knitter cable function is useful for doing that. There's also this flex table function from the flex table package that produces some very nice tables as well. So here's the same exact data set put through the flex table function, which took a little bit less work and maybe arguably looks even a little bit nicer. So we're going to try to do this as well by including a new chunk where we use both the cable and the flex table functions to reproduce this same table. So let's copy all this code exactly. And then maybe we'll make a new section, tables in R Markdown, something like that. Insert a new chunk, paste that code in. Okay. And then we can click knit and see how this looks. So the HTML table even looks a little bit nicer than it does when it's in Word documents. for knitr, the cable function with knitr. And there's lots of ways to customize the output. So here I'm customizing the alignment of the columns, specifying them as being left aligned, right aligned with a lowercase r, the number of significant digits, okay, whether to include row names from the data frame or not, the data table. So here's the row names that were included. All right, and so that was using cable. We can also look at using the flex table way. So you may have to run this code first to install the flex table package if you don't have it installed already. Once you run that code, which you can run, so I'll show how we can do that. You can paste that into the console here and then click enter to install that package. And then hopefully you see package flex table successfully unpacked and MD5 sums checked. That's great. That means the package installed well. Then we could include this code in a chunk. Oops. Okay, let's knit that. And here's that flex table, which is the same exact data set, just formatted a little bit differently than the knitr cable function. Okay. So that's how we can include tables of data, data frames in the output nicely with R Markdown. And the last thing we'll look at here is how you can use Word document templates. Okay, so Word document templates you can use to reproduce Word documents in a consistent way. So for example, when I did an internship at the US Department of Agriculture and their statistics service here, we would have these weekly reports that we always put out, or sometimes monthly reports, and they would be very similarly formatted every single time, just with the data slightly updated. Okay, so for example, here's when I was an intern there, going way back to 2015. Let's see. I was in the office here for when we were producing these, and every single report always has this title, Michigan crop weather. Like it was a report about the weather. You'd always have the logo up here. This number here would like increment based on each report. Okay, so you could use like inline R code here to increment that. Here it would grab the current date. So that's another place that we could use inline R code to dynamically have it update the date. There'd always be this, we call it a line chart produced based on the percent of the farmer's corn that was planted. So again, this is all a scatter plot that was produced based on like an Excel file. So making this whole report would involve like someone had an Excel sheet, they would update the numbers in the Excel sheet and then create the scatter plot and send it to someone else who would paste it in this document, and then maybe this other scatter plot would come from another person, this other line chart, And then there'd be this table of numbers that would need to be produced. And again, it was sort of like this Frankenstein of like piecing it all together every time. And it would take, it was quite a process to get these reports out each time. With R Markdown, this would have been greatly simplified. Maybe your R code would have been pointing to a data set that creates this line chart, this table, essentially produce everything in here, update the date automatically with the R Markdown document. This would have been much easier, and you could have maintained this same exact style, got the document to look the same exact way every time, using what are called Word document templates. So this is useful again when you have maybe this like banner, we would call it, this set of graphics and titles at the top that always you want it to be the same, just with different numbers and plots. That's when you can use this Word document specification in the YAML in the header of the R Markdown document. This is what allows you to use a template Word document. So here it's pointing to this Word doc that's going to be in the same folder or directory as your R Markdown file, and it'll copy all the styles or headers, all these types of things that were in that Word document, but allow you to customize the text and the data and the plots produced each time. That's a bit more advanced once you get more comfortable with R Markdown, or you need something like that. But when you're first starting out, you definitely don't have to use these Word document templates, but wanted to point them out because it's good to know that they're out there. Okay. And so many more things you can do with R Markdown. We just touched on a few in this activity. Here's an example of something I made in R Markdown when I was a graduate student a few years ago here. Made this transition animation function. I'm showing Goldie, our mascot there, transitioning in the R logo. Okay. So I was able to show, like, talk about what I did, show my R code that I made a function that could create a GIF to transition between two images. And RStudio has this free option. If you're knitting to HTML, like I did for this format, you can publish it online for free at this website. So you may have noticed when we clicked knit, since we were knitting to HTML, okay. After you knit to HTML, there's this option to publish up here. Okay. And you can like publish to RPubs. Yeah, you might have to update some packages and stuff, but if you wanted to go through those hoops of figuring that out, you have to like create a free account and stuff. It's kind of fun. You can create a website essentially for free, where you can host these HTML documents that you create, make them accessible to others. Anyways, okay, so we will, let's see, to finish up activity 2, I guess one last thing to point out, there's also this R Markdown cheat sheet. So we went over some things for the syntax, for example, for Markdown, about what you can do. This cheat sheet shows like chunk options, some more of them that we didn't go over. Different things you can do with R Markdown. It talks about, yeah, this publishing. I just mentioned at the end how you can publish it for free, an HTML document you produce online. So just a little more tips and tricks, extra stuff about R Markdown if you're curious in that document. Okay. All right. And so lastly, we'll want to submit this as probably a PDF document would be best for this one on Blackboard. So let's I'll show you how to produce it as a PDF document. So let's knit this. And to keep it just like this, we will open this up in a browser and print to PDF. That's one way to do it. You can also just submit this R Markdown file itself to Blackboard, and I would be fine with that. Note that if you try to knit to PDF, this will have an error because for some reason, grabbing images from a URL like this and including them in documents doesn't work when knitting to PDF. You have to be knitting to HTML. So to submit this via Blackboard, you can just submit this .rmd file. And if you want to submit this as well, you could open this in a web browser. And then if you're in Chrome, for example, you can print to PDF like this. And then save that resulting PDF document. Also, Control P is a way to print to PDF. If you hold that down on the page. It'd be slightly different for different web browsers, but it's the same idea of printing to PDF and then submitting that document via Blackboard. So that's it for activity 2. And that's our introduction to R Markdown.